This is Series 3, Episode 4, and we're welcoming back Samuel Andreyev for the third time.
Thank you so much for having me on again. It's a great honor to be a repeat guest.
Yeah, we don't have many repeat guests. I think Christian Book's been on here 6 times. He has the record.
Well, I'm happy to be in second place to him.
So there are lots of things we could talk about, and we have talked about a lot of these things privately anyway, but it'd be quite nice to get them out to the public or to the small fraction of the public that listens to this podcast. In particular, I'm interested in your thoughts on new media, which we discussed in the first time you were on. We talked a lot about YouTube and Twitter and the way that they're changing the role of the artist and giving more opportunities to artists. And then in the second half of the podcast, I'd like to talk about advancements in technology and how they are influencing artists and the good and bad of that. So, let's start with new media. You recently gave a talk at the first ARC conference. I'll put a link to this in the description. Your thoughts on new media seem to be very positive. You see this as an opportunity for artists who otherwise might end up discarded by the mainstream and living in poverty, and they now have an opportunity to do something that might be, if not financially rewarding, at least they'll find an audience.
That was the basic thrust of my speech at ARC, which was that it's important to have a sense of historic perspective, I think, because not so long ago, it was quite considerably more difficult to be an artist than it is today. And that's something that I really want to insist upon. So, in a sense, there are no more possible excuses for artists. If you're living in the developed world, then you have access to tools that would have been absolutely unimaginable to artists living in the not so distant past. So what those tools do is, first of all, they take away any barrier to publication, right? That's no longer an issue. So even 20 years ago, it was actually quite a lot more complicated to publish anything and put it out to large numbers of people. Now that barrier has been removed. So it's just not a factor anymore. If you're able to use a smartphone, then you can access a potentially limitless audience of people with no overhead, or a very minimal overhead, let's say. And the other thing is, of course, the access to information is virtually unlimited. So the difference between the world that I grew up in and came of age in is vast. So we got the internet in our house when I was probably 16, maybe. But it's worth pointing out also that, as with any new technology, it isn't as though the technology bursts on the scene fully formed and absolutely mature, right? The first years, it's not actually necessarily obvious what the technology is going to be good for, nor what it's going to change in our lives. So I'll give you an analogy. If you take photography, for example, early digital cameras were pretty bad. They were actually quite a lot worse than film in terms of quality. They were convenient in certain ways because you could see a low resolution image on the back of the camera. Whereas with film, of course, you would have to send it off to a lab before you could see what the image looked like. So things like that were convenient, but the actual image quality was substantially worse. So for the first 4 or 5 years, at least, of digital cameras, if you wanted to actually have the best possible image quality, you had to use film. It wasn't until 5, 6, or 7 years into digital photography that the technology matured to a point where it was actually better than film for most things. And it's the same with the internet. It's like, it was obviously a revolutionary technology, but for research purposes, it took quite a few years for it to catch up with what it was possible to do in a research library. There were lots of things like that. But anyway, nevertheless, the difference between when I was an adolescent and what is possible now is it's shocking, really. So, for example, if there was a piece that I wanted to study or a book that I wanted to read, then you had to actually track down a physical copy. And in some instances, if the book or the recording or the score or whatever it was rare, then that could be a very time-consuming and expensive process. So there's an anecdote that I often relate, which is that I got very interested in some of the early Stockhausen pieces, the pieces that he composed in the mid-1950s. And those scores were incredibly expensive. They were, $200 or something, which was a fortune, an absolute fortune for, a teenager who didn't have steady income. So, I had to save up for months in order to buy that score. And that was a really big deal. Whereas now, of course, you can just go on IMSLP or, BitTorrent or something like that and find a PDF of it for free. That just simply wasn't a practical possibility at the time. So the point of all this extended rambling I'm doing right now is to simply point out that we take these things for granted now, but these are extraordinarily revolutionary technologies. You can be responsible for the entire chain of production of any kind of artwork, from conception to execution to publication to communication. You can do all of that in-house with an extremely modest outlay. And that's pretty much available universally to everybody. The biggest thing I take away from that is there are really no excuses anymore. It's like there's no reason why anybody who has the inclination and the discipline can't make something and share it with other people.
Yeah, and that's the really good thing about it. I think that we'll get onto some of the bad things about it, but the really good thing is that you have an opportunity now to find an audience. If you're like me and you're living in the middle of nowhere and you haven't got connections, you can go online and find people that way, and you can build an audience that way. That's one of the great things. And as you say, you've got all these resources too that you would otherwise struggle to find or struggle to pay for. They're all there for you.
I think what we're also finding, though, is that traditionally there were gatekeepers that served as a kind of filter in terms of whose work would be brought to wider attention and whose wouldn't.
Mm.
And the gatekeepers, well, we know what they were. They were publishers and agents and record labels and all of this sort of thing. And the thing is, those channels still do exist, and to a degree, the traditional media still confers a degree of authoritativeness, I suppose, that the new media, in a sense, can't quite compete with. But there's this weird schism happening in the sense that if you get a rave review in the New York Times, then there's an authority that comes with that, even today. But the authority is tempered by the fact that if you get on one of the big podcasts, like Chris Williamson or Joe Rogan or one of those, then the audience for that podcast will be vastly bigger than the number of people who will read the New York Times. So there's it's a disequilibrium, if you like, between the perceived authoritativeness of the old media and the actual reach that is possible with the new media. And those two things don't quite line up.
Yeah. So this is one of the things I wanted to mention, is to talk about Penteract Press for a moment and how we've tried to promote and sell our books. One big stumbling block we've had is gaining a proper distributor, because there's no social media equivalent for that. I mean, you've got things like Etsy, but that's, again, anyone can do it, and you're not going to stand out necessarily using that. So when we've tried to use distributors, they often say, well, you're not publishing the kind of poetry we want to promote. But it's all experimental, and we feel like, essentially, I'm trying to say that they have their own agenda, whether aesthetic or political or whatever. They've got their own agenda they want to push, and we haven't been able to find a way in there. And we haven't got a new media alternative to that. So there still exists problems like that, where the only route is the traditional route. And it doesn't matter how well we use our social media, we're always going to hit that wall.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's true as far as it goes with physical publishing, of course. But I mean, there's equivalents in the world of music as well. There are things that, if you want to get them done, you do have to go through traditional channels. So, for example, if you want to write a composition for orchestra, then it's like, good luck doing that on your own. It's a practical impossibility. working with orchestras means usually that you need an agent. It means that you need orchestra managers. Means that you need a professional orchestra, all of which would be it. Unless you are vastly wealthy, you would need financing for all of that, and that comes through. Well, it comes through going through the traditional channels. It's impossible to do otherwise. But in music, as with poetry and publishing and other things, that's assuming that you want to do things that way, right? So, but you could also get a digital audio workstation, make the piece yourself, using digital samples or whatever, or you could just not write for orchestra. You could write things that you can play yourself, or write things that are entirely electronic, and then be entirely responsible for the distribution of them yourself. And with poetry or literature, it's like, yes, if you want to produce physical books, then you're confronted with that limitation, but you're not confronted with it if you publish online.
Yeah.
So I think different people will answer this question differently, but it's like there's a trade-off, I suppose. If you want to do things in a more traditional manner, then there are inevitably going to be limitations and challenges involved with that. And if you're happy to embrace these new possibilities that allow you to publish things instantaneously and potentially to a far larger audience, then that's also possible. So another way of looking at this situation, I think, is, I'll use another analogy here, which is the analogy of fixed media for recordings. So, we all know the story about how vinyl was the predominant medium for decades until cassettes came, and then CDs. And when the CD became a big thing in the late 80s and early 1990s, then everyone prophesied the death of vinyl, right? That's it. It's an obviously superior format. The technical specifications are superior. It's more convenient. It's smaller, better sound quality, et cetera, et cetera. But as we all know, that hasn't happened. What happened instead was the CD was popular for a while, and then the advent of streaming more or less killed it. And now that we have streaming, vinyl is having this huge resurgence. So it's like CDs are kind of in no man's land, and vinyl has returned with a vengeance.
Yeah.
So
cassettes will have their day. Cassettes will come back.
Well,
I believe.
Yes.
I firmly believe.
Yeah, well, you keep dreaming. Maybe. The point is, you can have an old technology and a new technology exist concurrently, and they can have competing advantages, so that you can choose. It's like you can use a digital camera or a film camera. Both exist, right? You can have vinyl or CDs, both exist, or streaming. You can publish in a traditional manner, or you can publish online. And instead of the either or prophecies that we've been accustomed to, which is like, well, ebooks are going to replace physical books, or streaming is going to replace physical media, or digital photography is going to replace film photography permanently. None of these things have happened. Instead, we find ourselves simply with more options. So that seems like, on the face of it, not to be a bad thing.
Yeah, well, like you say about ebooks and physical books, I clearly remember 20 years ago, everyone saying, well, this is the death of the physical book. And it really hasn't been the case. But I suppose there's no way to tell these patterns. There's no way to predict what's going to happen.
Yeah, no, that's true. And of course, you don't know what the trends are going to look like over the long term, on a multi-decade level. It's hard to say. Nevertheless, more options seems to be a good thing. And in any case, regardless of what it is you end up deciding to do, it doesn't change the fact that there really are no longer any excuses. Like if you're not publishing your work, if you're not putting it out there, then it's no longer because it's too expensive, it's too complicated, I don't have an agent, I don't have a publisher, etc. Like those things are not issues at all anymore.
Yeah. Well, what about the efficacy of social media? I mean, in particular, let's talk about YouTube and Twitter, because they're the ones we have talked about in the past. They're the ones we know best. How useful is it to be Samuel Andreyev with a big popular YouTube account? How many benefits do you see from that practically? And I'm going to talk both in terms of all the opportunities it affords you, and but then also on the financial level and being able to make a living as an artist.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. We can get into the details there a little bit, because the conventional wisdom is that if you want to make a living on YouTube, then you need to have a very high volume channel, which is to say a channel that routinely gets hundreds of thousands, if not millions of views per video, and a very large subscriber base. Actually, the subscriber base doesn't really even matter that much. Like the number of subscribers you have doesn't actually have any direct impact over how much you earn from your channel. What matters is how many people are actually watching the videos, and it's the click-through rate. Those are things that matter. That's the conventional wisdom. So by that conventional wisdom, I should be doing quite badly because my subscriber count is actually not particularly huge, and a lot of my videos get only a few thousand views. The best performing ones get several 100,000, but the average number of views for a video of mine is probably around 10,000, something like that, which is not particularly high. Like, it's certainly not high enough to
I wouldn't
make
complain.
No, I'm not complaining. I'm speaking in terms of the conventional wisdom of what it takes to earn a living on YouTube.
Yeah.
Right. I'm very far from that. So in other words, if you want to, first of all, cover all your expenses, so that means purchasing equipment, it means costs of if you have a production team, editors, producers, and so on working for you, which a lot of really big channels have, you need to pay all those people. You need to pay yourself a salary, and you need to have enough money to live off. Then yes, you do need to have hundreds of thousands of views per video. If the income is coming primarily through ad revenue and things like that. So by those standards, my view count is far too low for that. However, what's interesting is that it's actually profoundly changed my life on many different levels. It's brought me a far broader range of opportunities. It's put me in contact with a seemingly limitless number of fascinating people. It's resulted in many opportunities to travel. It's resulted in commissions, public speaking engagements, all sorts of things. And it's just transformed my life from top to bottom. So it not in the conventional sense of, making a living through ad revenue, not at all. But in terms of being a massive signal boost to my career, it just resulted in far more people knowing who I was. So even at the relatively modest level of my channel, and by modest, I mean in comparison to somebody who's doing YouTube full time, which I don't do. Nevertheless, my channel has had, I think, 2.5 million views, something like that. And if you compare that to what the average modernist composer would have had in terms of audience numbers in the 1920s, I mean, that would have been completely unimaginable. So I'm acutely aware of that.
Well, and it's good to be. I have to remind myself of things like this to say that, well, actually, far more people have read my poems than would have read most poets who've ever lived.
Well, how many people?
Because of the technology.
What do you think? What do you think Lorca's readership was during his lifetime? If you had to hazard a guess, how many people actually read Lorca or Rilke while they were alive?
Not many, I imagine. Although, as a counter argument, Lord Byron was selling tens of thousands of books in his lifetime 200 years ago, way more than poets sell these days. So anyway, no, but my experience with Twitter is, I was looking at some numbers earlier, and these are vague estimates because I can never know for sure, but I would guess that only between 1% and 2% of my Twitter followers actually buy my books. That could make me think, what's the point? But then, of course, I sell a lot more books to people who aren't my Twitter followers, and they only know who I am because I got my name out there on Twitter. So social media seems to be very good for that you get known through it, but then you're not necessarily selling the books to that direct audience. It's all spreading out into the real world. It's the stuff you don't see immediately, the word of mouth. So it has that too, as well as you say, the opportunities that it brings you. And I've definitely had some good opportunities because I've made myself known, and the way I've made myself known is through Twitter.
Well, again, my sense on all of this is just that it's very obvious that had I been born 50 years earlier, my prospects would have been way worse as an artist writing the sort of stuff I write.
Yeah.
Like way worse, to a degree where forget about making a living. It's like, would I have been able to produce the work at all under any circumstances? I'm not even talking about finding an audience or anything like that. It's like, in practical terms, would you be able to do it? And I don't know. I really don't know. I'm very aware of that. I'm aware of the fact that I have opportunities that the composers that I venerate from the earlier part of the 20th century would not have even been able to imagine these technologies. So I think there's a responsibility, there's a deontological sense that goes along with that, which is, you have these almost magical superpowers. Well, that's really what they are. They're magical superpowers. Like being able to go on the internet is a magical superpower. And then the question is, well, what responsibility does that entail? What do you do with that? How do you know that you're using these technologies properly? How do you know that you're using them to the best possible advantage, both for yourself and for other people in the world? And I think, reflecting on those questions is not time badly spent.
Do you feel any negatives to the way things have changed? And we're talking about music and poetry here, but one that strikes me with music is when I look at the sort of music I was into, which, about the punk and rock music of the 90s, mid 90s, those bands were making a lot of money. And these days, bands who are just as popular as them are making a fraction of that. And to go for the poetry side, as I say, I think only 1 to 2% of my Twitter followers actually buy my books. But I have fans on Twitter who like every tweet I do, or most of them anyway, and say nice things to me. But they're never going to buy my books because they can get my poems for free.
Well, look at it this way: it's well known that the music industry peaked in the early 1990s, in the sense that the amount of money that it was generating was, in the billions. It was a gigantic industry at that point. The number of CDs that it was possible to sell for a top act was gigantic, simply gigantic. You could be talking tens or even hundreds of millions of copies in some instances.
And sold at such a markup as well, when you think how much a CD costs to make.
Right. Well, that had a couple of effects. One of them was that it made the middlemen extremely rich. It made the labels very rich. The artists, nevertheless, did get screwed, even in those circumstances, strangely enough. Some of them became vastly wealthy very young. But it's also worth pointing out that that's extremely hard on people, and most young people aren't equipped to deal with it. How many rock stars became multimillionaires many times over at a very young age, couldn't handle it, and it killed them.
Yeah.
So it's not obvious to me that was necessarily a good thing all around, for that amount of money to be floating around the music industry. There's also a downside to that. It's not that I'm against people becoming rich. On the contrary, I want artists to do well. My sense is that it's much easier to handle if it comes gradually, and if it comes, through a fairly extended period of consistent work, rather than having it appear as a sudden windfall when you're in your early 20s. So maybe that's a weird thing to say as a downside of the music industry peaking in the early 1990s, but I think that it was actually quite bad for a lot of people. So everyone's going to jump on this and say, "Oh, he's a socialist or something." It's not like that. Again, I have to stress, I'm not against artists becoming wealthy, but there was something kind of not altogether healthy about that situation, let's say. So yes, it's true. Even the biggest groups now, I think, will have a hard time duplicating that kind of success. And then there's a very, very large number of acts that will never get anywhere close to, even basic subsistence from their work.
Yeah,
that's true.
Just think of the poets too. It's not like they were having a great time in the 90s, but it's got worse.
Well, how has it gotten worse for poets?
Well, that's a good question, isn't
Because
it?
I remember the 1990s, right? I lived
Yeah.
in Canada in the 1990s when Canada was sort of the place to be, weirdly enough. It's from our present day perspective, it's almost comical to imagine Canada as being the place to be for anything right now. But in the 1990s, though, there was a lively experimental writing community. There were a lot of good publishers. There were a lot of good poets, and it was sort of a good place for that. And but nevertheless, even in that situation, that like a really successful, like a phenomenally successful poetry book would sell 1,000 copies or something, and most of them sold less than 100. Even um, even books that were commercial trade publications from fairly major publishers, if it was a book of poetry, in many instances it would sell fewer than 100 copies. A lot of
Well, it sounds
people
quite
don't.
similar. The numbers you're saying sound quite similar.
But here's the thing, though. It's like in the 1990s in Canada, uh, the Canada Council had these regulations in place which defined what they considered a book to be, or what they defined it, how they would define a publication. And so, in order to meet those criteria, in order to meet the criteria for a publication grant, then if something like you had to make at least 500 copies of a book and it had to have at least 64 pages, something like that. Um, so you had all these publishers cranking out titles that they knew were going to be impossible to sell in order to justify getting these block grants, which were annual grants uh, available to publishers. And so it would be like, well, you'd have to put out, I'm making this up off the top of my head, but let's say you had to put out 12 titles a year. They had to be minimum 64 pages and minimum 500 copies. So what would end up happening is you would have all these books being published that for which there was no market, and then the unsold copies would eventually get pulped. It was kind of absurd. So on the face of it, maybe it looked better because there were more trade publications being put out and there was more grant money flying around. But I mean, nobody was reading these things. So was it any better?
Yeah, so far as I know, that's still what's going on.
It seems like a massive failure, though, like on the part of, I don't know, on the part of publishers, perhaps. I don't know, on
On
the part
the
of
system in general, I can understand that they would need funding, but the way that the funding system operates seems completely irrational. But why not allow books to be printed in print runs of 50, even if you think that's all it can sell?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm just glad I'm not the one who has to decide these things. I don't know. Is it worse? I suppose it's worse in the sense that, I mean, maybe you could argue that there's more ability for people to destroy the careers of others via social media than was the case 30 years ago.
Yep, that's definitely a downside. The positive side would be that even if poetry sales are just as bad as they've ever been, or maybe, as I suggested, maybe slightly worse, more poetry is probably being read now.
Mm-hmm.
So at least we have that people aren't necessarily inclined to buy poetry books, but that doesn't mean they hate poetry. I mean, it doesn't mean they wouldn't want to occasionally go onto Twitter or Facebook or Reddit or wherever and see what poetry is out there. Doesn't pay the bills, but it's something.
Yeah, it's the same thing in music. I mean, streaming has ended up being a catastrophe for the music industry in certain ways. It certainly made it quite considerably more difficult to finance and to monetize production of sound recordings. And that's true across the board. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're an absolute top act or if you're somebody who's just barely scraping by. It's the same. It's just as hard to justify a really expensive recording project now for anybody in a sense. So that's one of the consequences of Spotify, of being able to pay £10 a month and have access to the entire world's recorded legacy. It does devalue it in that sense, but then it also has the obvious benefit that people are listening to far more music than would have been the case in the past.
Yeah, and what's the current royalties rate on Spotify? So you
Oh,
you were
it's
worried a
yeah.
minute ago about sounding like a socialist. I'm worried now I'm sounding like a capitalist because I keep going back to the financial side.
Oh, well, I mean, Spotify is obviously not beneficial for artists, right? The royalty rate is, I think, 0.0003 cents. Not, is it per play, or is it, anyway, you'd have to have thousands of plays to get to earn a cent. It's something like that. It's something like that.
Yeah, so
So
it's shocking, isn't it? That's really bad. And yet, I suppose it can't be any other way.
there's no dialing it back. It doesn't seem like it. I mean, the nature of all of these technologies is such that once they're out there, it's very hard to put the brakes on them and say, wait a minute, maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. It's too late. It's like that with the internet. It's like, to a degree, you can police these things, and you can use maybe legislation, or various restrictions on the industry to try to mitigate the damage. But there's no denying that there's a profound shift. Like my own work as a composer, like the value of it, it's difficult to calculate, right? Because art has implicit value, which is the sort of general societal acknowledgement that it's worth doing on a certain level, and it might even be worth supporting. And it's actually pretty difficult to find people who would seriously argue with that. Everyone more or less accepts the value of art on some level, even if they might think that an individual artist is not very talented, or an individual piece might be quite bad. Nevertheless, you're not going to find people that would claim that the creative enterprise as a whole is, somehow detrimental or not worth pursuing. So there's an implicit value to the artistic enterprise, but as far as its explicit value goes, that's extraordinarily hard to work out. I mean, it's a huge problem. So the work that I do as a composer, what's it worth? It might have a negative worth, in the sense that it costs more to produce than it will ever generate in actual income for me, or for anybody else for that matter. It might have a negative worth, or it might not. Who knows? It depends on your time scale.
Yeah, and you got all these balancing acts here. We're trying to think about if what's happening now is useful for art or not. So you could say, for example, the fact that you have things like Spotify means that more people are listening to music, so more people are going to get interested in music. It's going to create more musicians, more artists. That's a good thing. Or will they see that they're getting 0.0000 whatever cent per play and think, yeah, I don't think I'll be an artist because there's really no financial reward for this. I'd like to know, we can only speculate, but I'd like to know if it's encouraging more artists or not, or if it's putting people off.
Well, I mean, I can only talk about the music world because that's what I know best, but I do a lot of juries, and I listen to a lot of contemporary compositions by composers from around the world. I do this all the time. And there's so many composers that it's impossible to keep up with them. There's hundreds and hundreds of them, thousands of them from every country. And that is new. So if you looked at the musical scene in the 1950s in Europe, for example, there would have been at best a handful of figures per country that would have had any kind of international presence. You could probably have counted the major composers of the 1950s on the fingers of two hands. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but compared to today, where there's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, and every composition program, be it in a conservatory or university or whatever, is churning out all these graduates every year. And that is new, I think. There are more people going to university. There are more people pursuing higher education. There are more people also with leisure time, quite frankly. I recognize that the current younger generation is worse off financially than the generation previous to that, which is not a positive indication, obviously. I recognize that there's a profound housing crisis in the UK and other places, which makes it extremely difficult for young people to get a foothold in the middle class and to purchase property and all of that. So in that respect, yes, things are worse probably for the current generation than the previous one. But then again, you see like unbelievable numbers of people getting into these impossible professions. So what's that about? I don't know. Is it a reflection of this kind of positivistic parenting where children are told that they can do anything they want if they just put their mind to it and follow their dreams? I don't know.
Possibly. I mean, there's also, I mean, we'll get onto this in the second half, but of course the tools are generally cheaper now as well. So you can download, well, maybe not Pro Tools, that's still quite expensive, but you can download something similar to that and you can record things at home. It's a lot easier to actually make the art.
Yeah, well, that's definitely true. So when I was, again, making my first recordings in the mid to late 1990s, I think I started consciously trying to make albums at around 1996, maybe 1995, 1996. And at that time, making a home recording, making even a really rudimentary home studio was really expensive. You had to have, one of those Tascam Porta Studios, a 4-track or an 8-track. You had to have microphones, and
which I did. I have one of those, and that was so expensive for what it was. When you look
exactly
back at it now, how useless it is.
Well, we're not talking a fortune necessarily, but I mean, and you know what? The funny thing is, I could never actually afford to buy one of those Porta Studios, so I used to rent them. I would go down to a music shop in Toronto and rent one for a month, and then I would have that plus maybe a couple of microphones and whatever else. I think I would occasionally rent keyboards, synthesizers, and things like that. But whatever it was, I would get that stuff for 1 month, and then that would be the window that I would have to produce my album. So I would have 30 days usually to record everything, and that was still a lot cheaper than actually buying a Porta Studio. I think they were $400 or something, and you could rent them for $40 or something like that.
Yeah, and now you can get something of better quality pretty much as a free download.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, like you can get Audacity for free, and the capabilities of Audacity are vastly superior to what even the best Porta Studio could do at that time. So I mean, I remember the first album that I tried to make, I had to bounce tracks, because it was a 4-track, and I wanted to do more than 4 tracks. So it's like you record 3 tracks and then bounce them to the 4th, and then erase the first 3 and keep going.
Yeah, and that's a scary process, isn't it? Because you've got to commit to it. You've got to commit.
Well, I'm nostalgic for it though at the same time though, because maybe you found this too. We're about the same age. It's like the constraints of the technology forced you to slow down and be very careful and deliberate and consider what you were doing. Whereas now it's like there's no penalty for just producing vast amounts of material very quickly, and there's no cost. Whereas back then, of course, you had to actually physically buy cassettes. And I remember, the cassettes were, again, not an enormous expense, but if you were 16 and didn't have a job, then it's like there was a limit to how many cassettes you could buy. So you'd have to tape over them or reuse them.
Yeah, and
be
that's
conscious of the fact that
save 1,000 WAV files a day, just all the different variants of the thing you're working on. Yeah, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but yeah, I agree with what you say, that I'm nostalgic for that too, because I don't like being able to continually tinker with something. I like the idea that you can just say, okay, if you're bouncing tracks, okay, I'm just going to commit to this, and it's done now. There's no going back. I like that. These days, I could spend, and I have spent, hours and hours working over the same bar of music, trying to get it exactly right, and I don't like it. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Before we do, I want to. I'm just gonna. I have a list of questions. I want to check I haven't missed anything. Oh yeah, here's another issue with new media. One of the things it's great for is it helps you to bypass gatekeepers. But aren't gatekeepers things that are always going to exist, and isn't that just going to emerge anyway? So if you happen to be favored by Joe Rogan, you're going to have a much better time than if you're not.
Yeah, that's true, of course. But I think that what's new now is the prospect that you could actually be Joe Rogan yourself. It doesn't mean that it will happen. It doesn't mean that it's likely to happen, because it's not. But who's Joe Rogan? It's like he's an ordinary guy. I think that's the whole point, right? Is that you can start your own podcast. You can have your own media organization. When I was in London for the ARC thing, I met Konstantin Kisin and Francis Foster, who were two comedians that started a podcast called Trigonometry. And it was slow going at first. They didn't have a very big subscriber base for quite some time. And now they've got over 600,000. And they basically created their own media empire from scratch, just out of the desire of two friends to start a podcast. So I think that part of it is new. It's like if you had in 1964 wanted to start your own network, it's like good luck with that. But that's actually that's a totally plausible ambition now for ordinary people. It doesn't mean you'll be successful at it, because obviously there's you need to have a range of skills, and you need to be willing to make some pretty substantial sacrifices in order to pursue this and do it in that sense. But it's in the realm of possibility, right? So you could actually
also
have your own media outlet.
You also need a lot of luck. I think luck plays a big role in which YouTube channels, Twitter accounts, podcasts become popular.
People talk about luck as though it were distributed in this fickle manner by some kind of superior being. It's like gold dust that only lands upon the heads of certain selected individuals. But that's not what luck is. Luck is where skill meets opportunity, and you can increase your surface exposure to luck. There are ways of doing that.
The universe is determined by randomness. Yeah. So the best YouTuber doesn't necessarily become the most popular YouTuber. The best podcaster doesn't become the most successful podcast host.
Depends on what you mean by the best. There are some people that have a knack for communicating with large numbers of people, and that's independently, I suppose, of questions of intellect or profundity or artistic talent. Sometimes those things go together, and sometimes they don't. But it's true that there are people that have a kind of common touch where they're just able to connect with large numbers of people.
Oh yeah, I agree with that. But I don't. This is the physicist in me talking. Randomness plays such a huge role in everything. Of course, it's going to play a role in who ends up getting the most YouTube subscribers and making the most money from their art.
Yeah, that's true to a degree, but it's not just pure randomness, and it's not like you can't interact with randomness in any manner. Like you're simply beholden to it, and all you can do is just sit back and watch as random distribution takes place. I don't think that's true, because the things that I've done, I could have also chosen not to do them, or I could have made other choices. I could just as easily sit here and say, well, if I had gotten spectacularly lucky 10 years ago, then I could have hypothetically been in a much better position today than I am. So you can look at it all kinds of ways.
Oh well, that's true. I mean that is the thing about randomness, that it really isn't worth worrying about. There's no point concerning yourself with the randomness of this, because
I don't think there is. I don't think there is much point really in dwelling on it. I think you have to focus on the things over which you have some measure of agency, and but not just the things that you have agency over, but the things that you could actually get yourself to do. Because, well, there's all sorts of things that I theoretically have agency over, but that I have a hard time controlling in my own life, as is the case with everybody. There are certain behaviors that we have that, for whatever reason, are difficult to keep in check, and everybody knows what those things are for them. But then, let's say there's a range of things that we theoretically have agency over, and then there are other things that we could actually trick ourselves into doing, let's say. And those two things overlap to a degree, but they're not identical categories. So, for example, I've tried to give up coffee. I've tried that a couple of times. Can't be done.
I did it.
Okay, well, you
If
could,
if I
but I'm
can do
talking
it,
about
if I can do
this
it,
is
anyone
where
can.
this
I'm
this
not very
this is
good.
a personal. It's a personal thing. Well,
I'm
when I
not very
say
good at giving
it
things
can't be.
up, but
Let's say that there's a trade-off of desire for the thing versus the benefits of stopping, and that's a personal thing. And in my case, the enjoyment of coffee outweighed the potential benefits of quitting.
yeah,
So,
I'm just gonna open another drink here.
right, okay, yeah, you get busy with that. Uh, the point is, there's a range of things that we know that we could actually trick ourselves into doing, and
Yeah,
maybe those are the things where it's worth directing your attention the most.
no, that's true. Should we start the second half?
Sure.
I'm excited to talk about this because it's been on my mind a lot lately. This is going to be mostly about music, though I think we'll bring poetry into it a bit. So, new technology and how it's affecting music, and how it not just how it is now, but how it has over the last 20 or so years. I want to start with a simple example, which is quantization
Hmm.
in production, music production. So, for anyone who doesn't know what that means, it's if, for example, you've recorded some drums, it's a way to make every beat of the drum hit the beat perfectly. Whereas human
Right.
drummers do not do that. They're off by a few milliseconds, or if they're bad drummers, a second, whatever. And you
Right.
and you can these days you can just line everything up perfectly, so it's right on the beat where it should be. And so the argument is that this stops the drummers from sounding like they're being performed by a human. I was going to leave that with you anyway. So to get your thoughts on this and the conflict between perfection and necessary imperfection.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's been detrimental to pop music. Maybe that's not a big deal for most people. Maybe it depends on how important you think pop music is, or how, like, because it hasn't affected all genres of music equally. So, for example, there are no drum machines in symphony orchestras. It's had zero effect on classical music. It's had zero effect on any of the things I do because I don't produce music in that manner.
Yeah, well, because we've talked about this before. I've been upset to see this happening in punk rock.
Yeah.
It really should be, in my view, anyway. It should be a style of music where you allow human imperfection to play its part.
Well, again, it's tricky because I think there was a gradual process there where when the technology first appeared, it wasn't necessarily obvious what the trade-off was. It's like, well, now we can do this, but what are the hidden costs? At first it presents itself as potentially another tool in the artist's toolbox. It's like, well, we still have live drummers, but now we also have drum machines. And then we have synthesizers, and now we have increasingly powerful editing technology. And it's an additional tool. It doesn't seem like a bad thing in and of itself. But here's an anecdote for you. I went on a Spotify listening binge the other day. For some reason, I went and listened to all the albums that the Beach Boys made in the 1970s, which is a strange thing for me to do because I don't really like the Beach Boys very much. But whatever, Spotify allows you to do these things. So I know their catalog actually pretty well. And the really early recordings that they made, it was like five guys, not particularly great instrumentalists, pretty good singers, but they played their own instruments on the very early recordings. And they played them, within the limits of their ability, but nevertheless, there was a kind of a distinctive sound. So if you listen to the really, really early singles that they did, it's not that polished, and it's got this kind of authentic, Southern California surfer sound or whatever that was distinctive. There was something individual and personal about it, and there was a real sort of spark to the performances. And then as you get into the 70s, once they're this huge act, and they stopped, they largely stopped playing the instruments on their own recordings as the 60s wore on. It was all session players, and the productions just become they turn into this smooth bland paste where you can't tell. There's no longer any distinctiveness to any of the performances. It could be anybody. It's totally interchangeable. No longer matters who's playing the drums. Doesn't matter who's playing the keyboards. Could be anybody. Totally anonymous sounding. That doesn't seem like a win, you know, unless you don't care about those things.
There are bands now who will record in the studio with a real drum kit, and then they will quantize the drums, but then also they'll go through the drums and replace each hit with a sample. And the result is that a real performance for the drums ends up sounding like a drum machine. And the irony that for decades people were inventing drum machines to try and make them sound more and more realistic, that now we've decided, or some people have decided, well, let's make this real drum kit sound like a drum machine. That's kind of baffling.
Well, I think where that is probably leading towards is a situation where AI will increasingly just take over these genres of music, because like if the music is really that generalized and bland, that you can just you can just replace everything with machines, then why not just take that to the next logical step further and just have machines compose it and produce it? Why do you need humans at all for that? Because a lot of the pop music that I'm hearing is just so bland that it's like the human dimension in there is completely negligible.
Yeah, well, I've seen that we're not far away. We're not far away at all from a situation where I might be able to. Let's imagine a universe where I can sing. So I might write a song on guitar and sing it, and then just put it through a program and say, okay, add a bass line that sounds like a Paul McCartney bass line. A drum beat that sounds like, well, not Ringo, maybe. I don't know. Like any drummer you can think of. I've forgotten all the drummers in the world for some reason right now. But so you could do that. You could write a song, just record the guitar and the vocals, and AI bass player and drummer. Perhaps with an orchestra too, you could do it. You could just perform it with a string section and then say, okay, now fill in the rest of the orchestra.
Yeah, that might be.
This doesn't sound very nice to me. This upsets me.
Yeah, I mean, what I would do is relate this back to earlier epochs and see if there are parallel developments that that happened in other points of history that we could relate this to. And one of these, I think, is the advent of photography and how that affected painting. And what it meant was that it was no longer as interesting for painters to produce realistic figurative images, because photographs could do that much more easily. So it's not, people didn't stop painting, they didn't stop producing paintings, they simply moved to a different type of visual expression that was extremely different, extremely distinct from what photographs could produce. So I think artists will tend to go, creative artists will tend to go into those places that technology can't go. Theodor Adorno wrote about this quite a lot in the mid 20th century, where there was this, at the time, relatively new phenomenon of mass communications and mass market commercial art. Right, there had always been in the history of Western music a kind of a division between savant styles, the high classical style, for example, and light music. And light music could be defined in different ways, but typically it was music for entertainment, for dancing, things like that. So that division has always existed, but things accelerated quite dramatically with the advent of mass production technologies like phonographs and television, other things like this. And so what Adorno observed was that you have this sort of very superficial and debased sort of mass popular entertainment on the one hand, and artists, in order to maintain any kind of legitimacy and also to provide an antidote to that, are forced to go in the opposite direction to that, which was the realm of the difficult, of sophistication, of the cultivation of extremely personal esoteric styles. So in other words, they occupied the place that was not compatible with mass entertainment. So those are the things that have happened in the past, and it's not reasonable to extrapolate that that AI will be able to do certain things better than humans can do them now, and that the creative types, first of all, can use AI as a tool. That's one option, but they'll also be able to produce things that AI can't do, and that they might want to focus on those things. So it's always it's always the artists working at the bottom of the cultural ladder that get the most massively displaced by these things. So it's like, if your thing is that you write Harlequin novels, you write genre fiction, then it doesn't seem unreasonable to suppose that AI will be able to crank those out 1,000 a minute, very, very soon. In fact, it can probably already do that. So if you're like a hack writer writing boilerplate novels and stuff like that, then there's no reason to pay anybody to write those anymore. It's the same with music. It's like, I don't think there'll be another Kenny G, because AI can probably fill that role very nicely. So we don't need to have Kenny G's anymore. And we don't need people to write elevator music or hold music or anything like that. It's like, that could all be the province of AI. And the reason for that is it's extremely generalized, and it's got very little to do with individual expression. So that's what you see with genre artworks of that sort, genre fiction, the things that are at the bottom of the cultural totem pole.
A few people have asked me, am I concerned about AI's ability to write palindromes? And I say, well, have you seen ChatGPT's attempts at writing palindromes, if you ask it to? And it's a mess. If you ask it to write free verse, on the other hand, it's it's not too far away from the poetry I see. So
yeah, that's true, but it's nowhere even in the remote ballpark of what Allen Ginsberg could write, for example.
yeah,
it can imitate surface qualities of things that were written in the past, because what all of these technologies are doing fundamentally is producing pastiches. They're not inventing anything. They're extrapolating based on a vast database, right, that they have access to. So I don't see any glimmer of anything that indicates the capacity for machines to do anything beyond that.
yeah, that's it. It seems to, it's very superficial in what it's looking for. Because if you ask it if you ask it to write a palindrome, it will say something like, here's a palindrome. And it will have, for example, Madam, I'm Elba. And you say,
Right.
that's not a palindrome, but it's using words that often appear in palindromes.
Right.
So it hasn't got it. It hasn't understood what it's been asked to do. It's just searched a huge database for palindromes and then spliced words together.
Yeah, well, I mean, what artists can do, what really creative people can do, I think, is they can make those unaccountable, unexplainable leaps that it's like, we don't know where they come from. This is the thing that a lot of people, I think, don't quite grasp is, like, for example, I've often used this example, but I'll use it again. There was a group of researchers in Germany that decided to use AI in combination with a team of musicologists and researchers to try to extrapolate what Beethoven's 10th Symphony might have sounded like. So for those who are listening who may not be familiar with the symphonies of Beethoven, he wrote 9 of them. And I think the ninth was completed approximately 10 years before he died. So he could have written a 10th symphony, and there were sketches for a 10th, but he never finished it. He got distracted with other projects. And so all we have for the 10th symphony is, a sheaf of sketches, which are inconclusive, to say the least, because they're not very advanced. So the idea was to produce a performing version of a 10th symphony by Beethoven based on these extant sketches. And what they did was they somehow fed the first 9 symphonies into some kind of a database. And in addition with the sketch materials, and got it to produce something that, was an extrapolation of what he might have done in the 10th symphony. But the completed piece is ridiculous. It sounds like a mashup of little bits and pieces of the first 9 symphonies, with a little bit of this thematic material that he had sketched out for the 10th thrown in. But it doesn't sound like anything more than that. But this was presented to the public as, oh, this revolutionary AI technology has completed Beethoven's 10th Symphony. It's like, first of all, it's an impossibility to complete Beethoven's 10th Symphony because the only person who can do that is dead. So it's like that's just not on the table. And secondly, it's a pastiche, and if you know those symphonies, you can very easily pick out the little bits and pieces here and there that have been sort of stitched together like a kind of Frankenstein's monster. So, but what he would have done had he lived, had he completed that project, would not have been it would not have been possible to extrapolate that from knowing the first 9 symphonies. So here's an example. The 9th Symphony is so utterly different from the 8th that there's no linear process of extrapolation that would, if you knew the first 8 symphonies, you could predict the 9th. You can't do that. You would not have been able to predict that he's going to throw in, a chorus and multiple soloists in the last movement. You would not have been able to extrapolate that he was going to write the Ode to Joy. You wouldn't have been able to extrapolate the increasing psychological effects of his deafness, or the strangeness of the opening movement. There's no hint of any of that in the first 8 symphonies.
I haven't heard this, but I have heard similar things. I've heard that there was a new Nirvana song made with AI.
Mm-hmm.
Just sounds so boring and not. It's just the general sound and the general feel, superficially like a Nirvana song, but it's really not like a Nirvana song.
Yeah. So no, I mean that's happening all over the place. There's the new Beatles song that was released a couple of weeks ago. That again, it's this homogeneous, bland, featureless gruel. There's like nothing in it, and I think a musician can tell that very easily. Yeah, so that's the sense in which I'm not threatened by the advent of AI as an artist. I'm not at all concerned with predictions as to the obsolescence of human artists, that AI is going to be able to do all of this better and cheaper. I think AI will, it will disrupt the lower rungs of the industry, and it might be a tool that artists will be able to use. But I think that there's always going to be highly creative people who are going to seek to do the things that can't already be done. So in other words, they'll be moving into that negative space that's defined by the things that technology can't currently do.
Are you excited by AI? Do you see this as something you might want to, a tool that you would use?
No, I'm not excited by it, weirdly enough. It's interesting, isn't it? Because let's talk about ChatGPT for a second in connection with that. It's like when ChatGPT came out, there were all these pundits on the internet saying, oh my God, like the world's changed forever. Look at this thing. It's like this is indescribably revolutionary. And again, maybe this is my own short-sightedness. This is my own inability to judge what constitutes a revolutionary technology. And there were lots of people in the early 90s who were like, well, the internet is going to be a passing fad, right? You don't want to be one of those people in retrospect where it's like, look how hilariously wrong he was about this. But no, I'm not, I don't see it in those terms. It's like, okay, well, we have ChatGPT now. We've had several iterations of it. Is it my lack of insight that causes me to think that things are actually not that different? The world doesn't seem to have changed in any fundamental way so far. It's like the thing is, it's easy for some of these technologies, we just sort of absorb them and they just become another toy that's kind of fun for a while, and then you move on to the next thing.
I don't find ChatGPT to be that different from just Googling things, because most of the time what you're doing is you're asking a question. You're saying, give me this information I need. And it's just a more efficient version of Google.
Well, here's something I wonder.
But also full of misinformation. So,
oh yeah, for sure. Well, it's very inaccurate. It can be very, very inaccurate at times. I mean, I tried a test once actually on this. This is a test anyone can do. I typed into ChatGPT, tell me about Samuel Andreyev. Who is he? So, and it wrote like a 3-paragraph biography of me, which was filled with inaccuracies, like really obvious inaccuracies. Like it would put in a birth date and it would be the wrong year, and it would say I was born in a town where I wasn't born. And I would ask it, provide a list of Samuel Andreyev's compositions, and it provided this long list of pieces that I hadn't written, with stuff like that. And I would interact with it and say, well, this is inaccurate. That's not right. That's not the right birth year, and so on. And it would say, it would excuse itself and say, oh, right, of course, you're right. Apologies for the confusion. And then it would provide another date that would also be wrong. And it's like, that kind of stuff just happens a lot.
It's bad at lots of things. I was writing a poem the other day. It's another. I've been writing lots of alliterative verse, and I was struggling to think of a word. So I said, "Okay, I'm going to just go to ChatGPT. Everyone's talking about it. Let's see if it's useful." So I said, "Give me words meaning." I can't remember what I was writing about. Something like snow. So words meaning snow that begin with the letter T, and it gave me 10 words. Only 2 of them actually began with the letter T.
Yeah, right.
You'd think that'd be an obvious thing that it could pick up, but no.
Yeah, but that's not how the architecture of that program works, though. It's predictive text, basically. So it's good at working out the statistical probability of word combinations occurring. But that's very different from what you're asking it to do. I mean, where I'm taking all of this, though, is that it's getting increasingly difficult to tell, I think, the difference between a technology that could actually profoundly disrupt things, that could actually have the potential to change human society in drastic ways, versus something that's just kind of, it's got that appearance to it, but it's just hype. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because there's so much hype coming out of Silicon Valley about the latest this or that, and a lot of these things just don't end up happening. It's like Google Glass never became a thing. The metaverse didn't really become a thing, or not in any form that seems particularly convincing. Just because something gets a lot of attention, it gets written about a lot, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen or that it's going to do anything. Some of these things undoubtedly will have a dramatic impact. It's just that I think there are also a lot of things happening where there's a lot less innovation happening than we actually think there is, and it's sort of papering over a lack of ingenuity somehow on a broader level. It's like how, in the 70s, it's like 70s pop music was actually pretty dire. It was a pretty bad time for music, I think, in many respects. But there was a lot more technology, so things kind of sounded very shiny and flashy and exciting. But the actual musical invention was not at the same level.
That's
I
interesting.
think things got.
Because it's so celebrated.
I'm not talking about prog rock and things like that, by the way, which are distinct subcategories. And no, I mean, in terms of pop music.
Yeah. Well, I suppose because I just think of the prog stuff, which I quite like, and then later on the punk, which I obviously like. But then, yeah, there was a lot of stuff that was
So
very, very obviously pop in a tacky way. But then we've always had that, haven't we?
oh, sure, of course. Yeah, in every era. I mean, the 60s had its share of embarrassingly bad. It's like, are there many people today who are big fans of Neil Diamond, or
Yeah.
Pat Boone?
Yeah.
I don't know how big he was in the UK, but
Big
this is
enough.
stuff that as a culture, we're probably happy enough to forget about.
So I'm going to get another quick check of the list. I was going to talk about synthesizers, and when they came in, that's a good example of, because a lot of musicians at the time hated the idea of synthesizers,
Mm-hmm.
whereas now they're considered perfectly authentic.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, we haven't used that word. We haven't used authenticity as a word in this discussion, and that's worth bringing in, the idea of what is authentic. Because I've hinted that quantization of drums or replacing drum sounds with samples is not authentic.
I
But
think
then,
there is no authenticity in commercial music, period. That's not what you should be looking for.
just in commercial music.
Primarily in commercial music, yeah. There might be some, but if it's there, it's fortuitous. mean, that's because it's not the point. The point is to project an appealing surface so that the thing will stick and people will want to listen to it repeatedly. You don't need authenticity for that. You just need the appearance of authenticity. It's a different question.
Well, you know, I've been recording. We've talked about this recently. Been recording these punk songs, and in fact, the new introduction to this podcast is a very short punk piece. And I can't play drums, so I don't have a drum kit. So I'm using a drum VST, and I'm doing everything I can to make it sound like a human being is playing it by going in, putting distortion on the drums and changing the. I'm doing the opposite of quantization. I'm moving the beats so that they're slightly off.
Mm-hmm.
And this is in an attempt to make it sound authentic, but of course it's not. There's no way it could ever be authentic.
I don't know. I mean, okay, so we take drum machines for an example. There are two ways that you could take this if I were to, drastically caricaturize the situation, reduce it down to a binary. But let's call it the Autechre approach. And what they do is they make music that is explicitly not performed by humans. Like no one for a second would think that. It's physically impossible. Like no human could ever play that fast or with that degree of accuracy or that degree of complexity with the overlapping rhythms and just the types of sounds that they're using in their compositions. It's manifestly and explicitly made by machines. And that's part of the aesthetic, and that's part of the expectation going into it, right? So you're not going to like pull up an Autechre track and sit there thinking, I'm so disappointed. It's like this sounds so artificial. That would be totally absurd. But then the other side of that spectrum might be, using machines, but trying to massage them so that they sound as human as possible, and trying to sort of paper over the mechanical origins of the sound production and make it sound a little warmer, a little bit more imprecise, a little bit more, gestural. And I suppose you have to choose. I think that any tool you use has limitations and is going to result in you being able to do certain things and not being able to do other things. And you can either go with the attributes of that tool and push them as far as they can go, or you can fight them, try to make them do something that they're not intended to do.
Yeah, it's a very difficult area though, isn't it? Because what really counts as authenticity? So if you add compression to a sound, or if you add some reverb to a sound, it could be argued that that's not authentic. It's not the actual sounds that the instrument made.
There's artifice in everything. It's all artifice, right? It's the simple fact of converting acoustic events in the physical world to electrical signals and capturing them in some manner or another. It involves artifice at every step. Where do you place the microphone? How do you set the gain? What sort of microphone do you use? Do you use compression? Do you use an amplifier? Do you use any kind of auxiliary effects like chorus or flanging or EQ, reverb, etc.? How do you mix it? How do you master it? How is the end product going to be listened to? Is it going to be heard in a taxi? Is it going to be heard on a $20,000 sound system? Is it going to be heard on a mono cassette recorder? It's like there are so many levels of artifice. The idea that we could somehow strip all of that away and have something pure and uncorrupted, and it's a total fiction.
Yeah. So this is why I've been struggling with these thoughts about it, because we both agreed earlier that the perfect quantization of drum beats is not pleasant. And yet now we're both advocating some sort of manipulation of sounds that it is pure artifice. So how do we reconcile those two things? Is it just a personal taste that you're happy with artifice in some areas and not in others?
Yeah, I think you can kind of tell when uh, the artifice is being used consciously as a way of getting a particular quality that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise. So here's another example. The the opening of Strawberry Fields Forever, it's a mellotron that you hear. And the mellotron was this instrument that had actual physical tape loops with instrument, very low quality instruments recorded onto them. And then when you pressed a key, the tape loop would come in contact with a tape head, and that would be your sound. It's like a totally bizarre premise for a musical instrument, but there you
Yes,
go.
very weird.
Very weird. And the idea behind the mellotron seems to have been something like, you could produce these sounds that would mimic an orchestra. But it's like, if anyone who's heard of mellotron knows, it sounds ridiculously far from the real thing. It's like it's a total abstraction. In fact, some of the samples don't even remotely resemble the instruments that they're purported to be imitating. So it takes on another quality. So, when Paul McCartney uses a mellotron at the beginning of that track, uh, like no listener for a second is going to think, oh, he was, this is a flute. you know, like I can't tell the difference between this and a flute. It's like, no, it's a quality that's being exploited for its own, its own aesthetic interest. So, I mean, all of that's fine. Doesn't particularly bother me. It does bother me when you hear a weirdly perfect sounding performance from a rock band or a punk band or whatever it is, where you can kind of tell that they're playing their instruments, but that it's been edited to death and just turned
Yeah.
into hash basically in the editing process. Like all the life has been just sucked out of it. That's a different thing, right? It's one thing when you're going after a particular aesthetic quality, and it's another thing when there's a certain verisimilitude. It's you can tell there's a band playing, but it's way too precise, and
Yeah,
that I'm not a big
it
fan
annoys
of.
me. It really annoys me when you see a band live that's so much better live than they sound on the record. That shouldn't be the case.
Well, listen to the Velvet Underground did a live album. I think it's called 1969. And they were pretty atrocious live. Like if you look at it from any kind of technical standpoint, it's out of tune, it's not together, it's sloppy, terrible PA, terrible mix, but it's great. I wouldn't trade that for anything. There's another live album they did called Live at Max's Kansas City, where it's like an audience member recorded them with a portable cassette player, handheld or something.
I bet that's good quality.
Oh yeah, it's like absolutely atrocious sound quality, obviously. And it's, them playing live in this crowded place with terrible acoustics. And, it's technically as bad as it's possible to be, but it's great. It's a wonderful album. There's lots of things like that. So, I guess if that sort of thing bothers you, then there's lots of music that is the opposite that exists and it's not going away. You just it's like in private life, we can choose what sort of company we keep, right? Nobody's
Yeah,
forcing you to
yeah,
go.
exactly. It's the same with art, isn't it?
It's the same with art. It's like nobody's forcing you to go hang out with, a bunch of criminals and associate with, car thieves, right? And nobody's forcing you to go and listen to this like overproduced, synthetic, lifeless punk music.
Mm.
It's there. It exists in the world. Lots of bad things exist in the world. Lots of terrible things. If you
Yeah.
care to
Arguably
focus your
worse than
attention on them,
overproduced music.
possibly even worse than that. Yeah. But here's the thing. It's like there's nothing easier than ignoring art that you're not interested in. It's very easy to do. So just change the channel and give attention to and boost the signal of things that you like.
Yeah,
And I don't think it's like a universal issue that every single musician is doing this now.
no, it's, I mean, that's, I suppose that's my fear, that it feels like it's gone that way so much that this will become the standard way of doing it.
The really great creative figures, though, have never done things the standard way, ever. Like
Yeah,
like Duchamp could have said, well, everybody's producing the same type of painting in 1908 or something, and I'm going to do this instead. Like he could sit there and think and just sort of hold his head in his hands and despair and say, oh, there's no point. It's like, everyone's doing this crap. The creative people are the exceptional ones that do things differently and that don't accept the status quo. And of course, there's always going to be masses of people that will produce things in a kind of very uninventive and standard and bland way. That's true. That's always been true. And it's probably been made easier for them to do that because of technology than it would have been the case in the past. But that gives more birth to genuine, authentic creators to stand apart from the crowd. It's easier to do that now. It's actually easier to stand apart from the crowd now than it was at any other previous point, I believe, because the crowd is so big and it's so homogenous now.
yeah.
You just have to do things a little differently, and people will go, ah, that's interesting.
And that's the message, isn't it? That's a good message to end on. Unless you have anything you want to add.
Yeah, that's about it. I think that would be the message that I would take going forward is, really look at our current situation from any historical perspective, and you would have to conclude that we're unfathomably fortunate in our circumstances. That's something I would like people to reflect upon a little bit more. Of course, it's easy to complain about this or that. And we would all like to be wealthier, and we would all like to have more stable societies, and we would all like politicians to be a little bit sharper and a little bit more honest, a little bit less corrupt. We would all love that. But how were things in 1943? How about 1915? How about 1870, 1796? Better? I don't think so. If you could produce these things in war-torn countries in 1943, what could we do now? That's the question. What are we capable of? What will we do with our technological capabilities and our freedom and our comparatively, immeasurably better material circumstances? So there are no excuses.
Yeah, no excuses. That's the message of this podcast. No excuse. Get to work, musicians and poets, and all you other artists. Samuel, thanks so much for doing this. I know I've kept you up late, so I'll let you go now. But thank you again.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.